How's it going, guys? Welcome to the Trades and Grades podcast. I'm your host, Noah Wright. This is the Week 6 recap in the NFL. Um, Pretty weird week in terms of running backs. We've had an abnormally large amount of waiver wire streams who did exceptionally well, much better than I would have anticipated. I know that there were a couple players that may not have super high like long term relevance, but would have been great ads if you had some injury issues. And we will get to those. But yeah, it has been a interesting year thus far. I know that there has been approximately, and I saw this on Twitter, almost 100 less touchdowns scored through week 6 of the NFL than there was in the last year, which was down from the year previous to that. And the fantasy output as well has been diminished in comparison to prior years. Um, it's just been not a lot. There's not been a whole lot of high powered offenses. It seems like a lot of these games. I mean, we're forced to watch the Broncos every single game. So every primetime game that is. And so that's been, plaguing the NFL from that standpoint. But um, it's been tough to watch some of these games. And it seems like there's not a whole lot of action from a fantasy football point of view. But nonetheless, we're still here breaking it down. So we'll kick it off with the winners of week 6. Deon Jackson. What a pickup if you picked up Mr. Jackson from your waiver wire. He had an astounding week for the Indianapolis Colts running back third stringer Jonathan Taylor's out. Nyheim Hines out with a concussion. Deon Jackson to the rescue. Had 79 receiving yards on 10 receptions, 42 rushing yards, and 1 touchdown on the ground, 28.1 points. If you picked him up and you needed a running back, he provided you that value. Now, moving forward with Jonathan Taylor coming back, obviously, Jonathan Taylor is one of the best running backs in the NFL. But will Deon Jackson take over for Nyheim Hines in his role? At this point, 23 years old, he showed he can have that volume in the passing game 10 receptions, 79 yards. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Deon Jackson take over and Nyheim Hines kind of loses his role, who hasn't even really shown that his role has been that important in the last couple of years. He had a solid running back 2 year a couple of years ago, but since then, Hines has not really proven that he's got much fantasy relevance, which has been kind of sad because I feel like he'd be a pretty good complement to Jonathan Taylor, but clearly it's not in the cards for him. So Deon Jackson might be a sneaky pickup if he hasn't already been picked up in your league. Stash him and just see what his role is going to be like with Jonathan Taylor back. I think it'll be pretty telling if he's going to have any fantasy relevance once Taylor's back in that passing game, which I kind of hope he does. I think he did a pretty solid job this past week, showed some signs of life for the Indianapolis Colts offense. Let's keep an eye on Deon Jackson. Rhamondre Stevenson, one of the biggest pickups in the last few weeks. In my league in particular, he might not have been available in everybody's leagues, but in an overwhelming amount, I would say after drafts, based on people could have drafted or dropped him after being drafted based on the way they're using Damian Harris. He wasn't having a super great season through 2 weeks. He'd only scored about just under 11 points total for the year. So I could see some people getting a little upset by that. But he's now gone in the last 4 weeks 20, 13, 19 and a half, 25 points. Currently at running back 9 on the year with those 2 dud games at the beginning. Fantastic pickup. If you need an RB2 or a flex, Rhamondre Stevenson has provided. He is that guy this past week. 4 receptions on 15 yards, 76 rushing touchdowns, but those coveted goal line rushes. He's had 2 rushing touchdowns. Love to see it for a guy like Rhamondre Stevenson. As Damian Harris has been injured, we'll see kind of how that goes once Harris is back from his injury. But as of right now, it is all Rhamondre Stevenson, which I personally love to see. I don't have him in, I think any of my dynasty leagues except for maybe one and none of my redraft leagues. So I'm sad I'm not a major holder of the Rhamondre Stevenson stock, but if you are, you're very much enjoying your fantasy outlook right now. Kyle Pitts, yes, a winner, somewhat. I will take it. This might be one of the biggest losers of a winner, but he had a touchdown. A touchdown, not in London, not overseas, in the regular season, in America, on American soil, and it counted. A touchdown for Kyle Pitts. He only had 3 receptions for 19 yards and that one touchdown, but double-digit points for him coming out of a lull in which he's coming off an injury. The game before that, he only had 3.5 points. So right now, we're just kind of waiting to see, will they use him at all this year, or is he pretty much just going to be one of the biggest busts in redraft fantasy football that we've had in a long time, because they've used him. They're using him an insane amount of blocking play. Sorry, an insane amount of rushing plays using him as a blocker, and so it's just not something that you want to see. You want to see him running routes. Guys like Mark Andrews, who block almost never. You certainly don't want to see a guy like Kyle Pitts blocking a good amount. So we will see what Arthur Smith has in the cards for him. Unfortunately, I'm not terribly optimistic for the rest of the season. So this is one of my chances, I believe, to get Kyle Pitts in on a winner. So we had to fit him in there. But we're going to continue with the tight ends. Move on to Mike Gesicki. What a week, taking all the touchdowns from my guy Jalen Waddle, who I have in my redraft team. I'd have much rather had him have touchdowns. He still had an okay week, but 2 receiving touchdowns, 6 receptions, 69 yards, 24.9 fantasy points. If you were starting him before, it is most likely because you had nobody else, as he had a pretty below average start even for a tight end. 1.14 with a touchdown, 1-4-4, nearly 25 points this past week. So pretty on the low key, hasn't been doing a whole lot, and then goes crazy this past week. I'd be trying to sell high if that's even a thing. He's had a pretty bad year. If somebody really wants him in one of your leagues, I'd be very willing to sell him at this point because of the pretty high game that he had this past week. And our final winner for week 6, Mr. Jamar Chase. If people were worrying about, defenses playing differently on him, T. Higgins is not in there to try and take some of that away, some of the defense away. They're not running routes correctly for him. Any doubts at all that Jamar Chase was going to have some sort of lull, as the last 4 games he's had 10 points, 12, 12, 12, 32 this past week. He had 7 receptions on 10 targets, 132 yards, and 2 touchdowns. What a fantastic game for Jamar Chase in New Orleans, where he went to college. I think that maybe had a little bit to do with it. I think he had just a little bit of extra motivation. So I'm excited to see him perform well, kind of go back to what we all know him to be, which is one of those alpha wide receivers, superstars. Final winner from week 6. While there are winners, we also have losers. And there are quite a few losers from week 6, starting with none other than Mr. J.K. Dobbins. As much as it hurts me to say this, because I love J.K. Dobbins, I love this I love him as a prospect coming out of college, stud. The knee injury was just devastating coming back from that. Since then, he has just not been what we had hoped he would be before the injury, and I'm not entirely optimistic about the rest of the season as well. So far this year, he's played in 4 games. He's gotten above 50% snap share in 0 of the 4 games. He hit 50 one time. And the one game he hit 50% snap share, he had 22 points, 13 rushes on 41 attempts, 41 yards on 13 attempts and 1 touchdown. And he had a couple receptions for 22 yards and a touchdown. So 2 touchdown game kind of inflated the points there. But with Kenyon Drake coming into the equation, he is one of those guys that takes a large amount of the receptions. And while J.K. Dobbins wasn't a guy who's going to be funneled a lot of targets, it's still limiting the amount of PPR points he's going to be scoring if he's only getting the ground game, and he's not been entirely efficient when he gets the ball. This past week, though, Kenyon Drake, 10 carries, 119 yards, and a touchdown. He only had 2 targets. He caught one of them for 8 yards, but he's one of those guys in the past that has been solid at, in the passing game. Earlier in his career, 2017, 2018, 2019, he had 48 targets, 73 targets, 68 targets when he was with Miami and then Arizona. So we will see if Kenyon Drake is going to be the thorn in J.K. Dobbins' side. But for this past week, if you're a J.K. Dobbins holder, I'm not envious of you, to say the least. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, loser number 2. He had a fantastic year through 4 games. He got up to one point the running back 3. And then he faltered a little bit against the Raiders, had 6.5 points. And, he only had 15 rushing yards on 9 carries, 3 receptions for 20 yards, no touchdowns, which he'd been pretty much just getting being force-fed in the red zone. He had 5 touchdowns in his first 4 games. But at this point, he's kind of slowed down. This past week, 3.3 fantasy points, 9 carries, 33 rushing yards, no touchdowns, not even a single reception, not even a single target either. I don't know how to feel about Clyde Edwards-Helaire at this point because you don't want to sell him now unless people are still valuing him at the top 10 running back level, because he is pretty much down at the low point of his season so far. Most likely should have sold, after the first few weeks. But it's difficult to say with that Kansas City Chiefs offense. You just never know who's going to be scoring touchdowns. It's going to be a high-powered offense, but you just never know when it's going to happen, who is going to be. We saw those CEH early on in the season. Will that continue? It's hard to tell, but it's not a guy that you're going out and looking to buy, and I'm probably not, unless I can get something that I think is worth selling for. It probably is best to hold on to him, as unfortunate as it is. Loser number 3. Well, actually, it's a couple of losers. Seattle wide receivers, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. They have been surprisingly very good this year, thanks to Geno Smith. A lot of people were worried that Russell was gone, how that was going to hold up. Turns out Russell maybe is just not entirely great at quarterbacking. And Geno Smith is maybe very good at quarterbacking, dare I say, at least in Seattle. Looking at it this past week, DK had through 2 receptions for 34 yards. It's good for 5.4 fantasy points. Pretty much a dud this week. And Tyler Lockett, who was in the top 10 at wide receivers overall this year, 3.7 points, 2 receptions, 17 yards. A pretty weird game against the Cardinals, very low scoring, which has been very different than what Seattle's been doing so far this year, which I don't think very many people saw, which was this high-powered Seattle offense, kind of proving everybody wrong. But if you have DK or Tyler Lockett, I'm not worried. It's how it's gonna be with those guys. The boom or bust. Tyler Lockett especially so with those deep ball targets. I'm not too worried about either of them. It just sucks. They're losers for week 6. And if you had them playing in your lineup, like I did in my dynasty league, I had both of them playing. You're a very, very big loser. So double loser. And our final losers of week 6, the Jets wide receivers, which really you should just say is the Jets quarterback, because at this point, it doesn't matter what Garrett Wilson or Elijah Moore do. It's only dependent on what Zach Wilson's going to allow them to, or them allow Zach Wilson to do. However you want to put a spin on that, they're pretty much screwed without a quarterback like Joe Flacco, the GOAT, throwing the ball 500 times a game, because Zach Wilson clearly is not able to keep up with Joe Flacco, which is not what you want to see in your supposed top 5 quarterback that you chose in the NFL draft last year. He had a pretty bad game against the Packers, but it didn't matter. They got it done with Breece Hall, because Breece Hall is the running back 1 from this past class, somebody that we touted all offseason. He's been building up, proving up to the hype. If you're in a dynasty league right now, he's almost unattainable. He's getting to the Jonathan Taylor levels. I know some people are even putting him above Jonathan Taylor, which is kind of ridiculous. I know it's just recency bias, but he is getting up there. So if you have Breece Hall, I would not give him away unless it's for an insane amount. I would go buy Breece Hall for pretty much anything, because at this point, and this is especially in Dynasty, whatever is like an overpay today, generally speaking, it's going to be underpaid tomorrow. He's going to be a star in the league, barring anything abnormal, which happens. I mean, it happens all the time. But if you're saying today, right now, I mean, he's going to be a top 3 Dynasty running back for the next 3 years or so, I would say. And right now is the cheapest you're probably ever going to get him. If you got in Jonathan Taylor's rookie year, it's a heck of a lot cheaper than you can get him right now. You're going to ride basically the Jonathan Taylor train throughout this year into the next year, then you most likely would want to sell your Dynasty. But at this point, if you're looking to buy somebody in redraft or in Dynasty, at a certain point, it gets a little ridiculous, but Breece Hall is the guy that I'm looking to buy, even though I know it's going to be expensive just because he's so good. And he's just, one, I have a little not recency bias, a little bias just from the fact that, coming off of this, we spent a lot of time this offseason watching him, and I just want him to succeed. And so seeing him succeed now and that coming to fruition has been fantastic. But all said and done, the wide receivers to the Jets, losers for week 6. Not sure that they're going to be able to build. I'm not sure how they're going to get over the hump with Zach Wilson. It's going to be difficult. He's not been entirely successful. Garrett Wilson only had 1.8 fantasy points, and Elijah Moore had 0 targets. 0 in week 6. That's just unacceptable in my opinion. From the year he had last year, getting him 0 targets is kind of embarrassing, negligible on their end. I know they're winning games, so to each their own, but you got to get him involved at some point. I'm not coaching the NFL. I know they don't care about fantasy football. Perfectly fine, but when you face good rushing defenses, and Breece Hall can't do everything, you're going to need to pass the ball. I don't think they will. That is it for week 6. Man, doing this solo, probably not the best. But appreciate you guys listening. Hopefully, you get a nice little recap from this week. Move it into week 7. We're going to have the week 7 outlook, who we think are going to be players that are going to dominate this week. And we'll see you on the next episode.